Record. All right, we are good to go. Welcome everyone to this event. Meet a deaf professional. Today, we are honored to have Joe Dixon. This is his sign name. He's coming here and he's going to explain to us about his experience as he was raised, his background, and his work as a deaf pastor. What's your sign for that, pastor? Okay, pastor. Great. Got it. Thank you. So really excited to discuss about that and get to know Joe a little bit more. And again, just to remind you to please keep your screens off. That way we have the best visual experience for everyone. And also, if you happen to see a lot of black screens, then what you can do is you can right click on any one of the black screens and click hide non-video participants. And that erases everybody except who's presenting. Okay, so Joe, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where were you born? Where were you raised? Actually, where I was born is Nashville, Tennessee. I was raised there. I grew up a little bit north of Nashville, Union, and I moved to Columbia. So I've driven all around Middle Tennessee. And I moved here to Cleveland, Ohio, 8 years ago. And the reason I moved here was to set up deaf churches. And I'm a full-time deaf pastor here for the last 8 years. And so, yeah, that's it. So you mentioned that you have your roots in Middle Tennessee. So tell us a little bit about your birth. Were you born deaf? Were you born, did you lose your hearing later? Explain a little bit more about that. Sure. Well, when my mom was pregnant, she was sick, and I was sick as well when I was born. And so at that time, the doctors thought I would be blind and possibly paralyzed and have brain damage and all of that, and then deafness. So I survived, and they sent me home, and I couldn't hear. And really,
I know it's more than just 3 people.
probably right before, hang on just one second. I accidentally muted the interpreter. Go ahead. Before I was 2, my parents were wondering, they're like, something's wrong. So they took me to an audiologist and they found out I was deaf before I was 2. And that was about the same time, I had my one hearing aid in my right ear, my left ear. I couldn't wear a hearing aid. So you used one hearing aid growing up? Yes, on the right one. I had a little bit of hearing, really more than 80% loss. But with the hearing aid, maybe 10 to 20%. But the audiologist said it was 80 decibels. So severe to profound loss without the hearing aid. And my audiologist was really strange. Mostly, my audiogram looked like this. And then it decreased from there. They tried to put it on the left ear and that didn't work. But they put it on the right ear. Of course, I cannot talk on the phone. I can't really understand speech, and so I had to take speech or sign. So you mentioned that you used the hearing aid growing up and you could lip read a little and sign. So can you explain a little bit about your school experience when you were growing up? Did you sign? Sure. When you were growing up, what kind of school did you attend? My experience growing up was I went into an oral program only, and that was from pre-K to 3rd grade. 4th grade, my parents realized that I needed sign language. Before that, they didn't think it was not offered. And so they realized that I needed sign language instead of only speech reading. And so I had total communication and a full communication program from the 4th grade. Sadly, from 4th and 5th, and they were 4th, 5th, and 6th grade classes all combined. And they taught a really low level. It was a low level, it was not very qualified education. And my parents realized that I wasn't really learning things. So I was mainstreamed. And at that time was the first time I had an interpreter sit in front of me in the mainstream, in the public classroom. And I achieved really well at that. And the interpreter sat in front of me all the way until I graduated college. Perfect. So you've got a lot of experience in mainstream program. And so I wanted to point out that the sign that you're using, there are 2 different signs for mainstream. You sign mainstream like this, and there's another sign that is like this. So can you explain about that, the difference between those 2 signs? You can use either. Either one is acceptable. I've seen both of them, but I grew up using mainstream. The reason why is because there's like one kid that's deaf most of the time, meaning just one. If, there's more than one child, then you would use both hands open. But for me, there were no other deaf children, so I was the only child there that was deaf. Okay, great. That's really important topic to discuss, because I'm sure a lot of parents do not realize the difference, the different kinds of mainstream experiencing that there is. Great. Wonderful. So that experience, and now you've graduated college and you're a deaf pastor and you're teaching in the church and the community. So what made you feel interested in that kind of work? Well, that's a long story. Short version is I planned to graduate college and go to law school because my interest was in law. And also, I went to study in another country for 4 months while I was in college. And I went to London. And while I was there, I did an internship with a law firm. And again, it was all spoken. But thankfully, my college at the time had offered 2 interpreters to go full time with me to the other deaf students. And so I was thinking about law, and my grades were not really great in college. So I decided before I applied to law school, was to major in counseling and psychology program. And the reason why is because it applies to ministry later, if I wanted to transfer and be a pastor or whatever. And so I felt that I was being called to be a pastor. I felt that some time ago, since I was 19 when I was in college, but I had a lot of doubts. I was like, did I really want to do that? And college at that time offered me a full scholarship, if I was in the pastoral program there. And I turned it down because it required an immediate graduation to become a pastor. And I felt, I'm really too young. I'm not married yet. I've not had a lot of experiences. And it's kind of awkward. So I was like, no, I don't think that's right for me. And so God, kept talking to me, maybe later, when my hair is lighter, when my kids are grown, at that time, I'll be ready to become a pastor. I felt that. But God had other plans. So when I graduated my master's in counseling and I met my wife during that program, I applied to a law firm, and there were many that wanted interviews because my resume was really good. But a lot of people turned me down because they found out I was deaf. And at that time, there was no video relay at the time. There was only IP relay through through AOL Messenger, IP relay. Yeah, like a TTY and text. Yes. So I said, I can call or whatever I need to do, but they turned me down. Many times I was turned down. So hang on just a second. Do you consider that discrimination? Oh yeah. Uh-huh. actually, the Americans Bar Association was going to help me find a job at that time. And one email, I copied everything and they saw it as well. And they wanted me to sue. And my type of lawsuit, I really didn't want to do that. So I just dropped it and I accepted a lower paying job for like $10 an hour. It was a lower paying job. And so that's where I got my start. So, and then you found your passion with pastoring. And so obviously you're where you need to be. Yes. 3 years later, really, I accepted a job as, I'm sorry, 3 years later, you accepted a job. I accepted a job, an internship for pastor at Brentwood Baptist Church in Nashville. And that is where I started learning. So now that church, Brentwood Baptist Church, is that a deaf church? Yes. That's something many people maybe do not realize, is that there's something available like that, and that there are different faiths related to different groups and deaf people as well. Yeah. So I started there because they offered me an internship, because most seminaries, they don't offer interpreters, unfortunately. They want you to pay for your own interpreter. And so I was learning and training. And so that was one program that we offered, and I took it. And then 3 years later, in 2014, I moved here. Wonderful. So now where you're working, you're heavily involved in your community, with the people, with the deaf, with hearing, and everyone. So that leads us to our topic. How do you connect to a deaf community? So the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, why is it important to be involved in the deaf community? Understanding, with keeping in the back of your mind, that most of our audience tonight has deaf children who are 0 to 5. So those parents and those families, why is it so important for them to be involved in the deaf community? Well, for example, teaching ASL classes free for the church community, for the church and for the community. And also people who become students and they learn ASL, it's a basic communication. It's not the same as having conversation with a deaf person. And I always tell my students, I can teach you, and that will bring you up a little bit, and it will give you some confidence for communication, just a little. But really, you have to socialize with the deaf. And the reason why, it's like riding a bicycle. If you ride a bicycle more and more, you learn, and it becomes a natural skill for you, and it gives you confidence. And so I tell my students, ASL signing is easier to learn because you rely on muscle memory, and it becomes really easy, and it's visual too. And most people are really visual learners, but that requires a lot of involvement and socializing and visualizing, and become natural, and not really having to think about it and analyzing which sign should I use, and that it becomes natural because it's expressive. The face is expressive. Everything involved with it is expressive. And again, it's like riding a bike. Once you learn to ride a bike, you can ride a bike with other people, or you can ride it alone, but it's better to go with the community. You learn faster and you get more confidence as well. Oh, yes. I like your metaphor with the bicycle. Of course, with people, when they start learning to ride a bike, they tend to have something called training wheels on the back. And that's like a deaf mentor, or a parent advisor, or a friend, or a pastor, even, someone to come alongside you and walk that journey with you, to lead you into the deaf community. And then, through time, you can ride the bicycle on your own and just go. So I really like that metaphor. So you had mentioned ASL and using ASL and socializing with the deaf community, but I know that not all children are actually using ASL. Like, for example, you said that you grew up in oral program until you were in the fourth grade, and then you started signing. And, your family and children who are still, they're on the fence, learning ASL or maybe not using ASL at all. Is it still important for them to be involved in the deaf community? Well, many people do not realize that the deaf community is very broad. It's very broad. It's not just one way. I started the oral program. I didn't have any sign at all. And then next, I learned how to sign exact English, which was CSEE. And I learned from the big yellow book. People probably remember the big yellow book. And then later, having the interpreter sit across from me and also to college is more PSE. PSE, what does that mean? So it's Pigeon Signed English. So what you're doing is you're taking ASL signs and putting them into an English word order. Oh, okay. So there's not a they or is, no, or to, but everything is in English word order. In college, I focused more on PSE, having the interpreter with PSE growing up. I had PSE, not really ASL until I was in the deaf church and socializing with the community. And even now, as a pastor, I do ASL. But for my students, if you sign really basic, it's almost right. Hey, you're good. I accept it. And it's worth it. I'm not going to be strict and, no, that's not right. That's not good as ASL. I'm not going to defeat someone for that. But as a deaf person, I sign ASL, but really I sign a mix of PSE and ASL. It just really varies. Most deaf in our church and in the community, they really didn't learn to sign until they were in college or even later in life, because they grew up in an oral situation or their parents didn't know how to sign. So later on, and they went out in the world on their own and they learned this and they became bonded with the deaf and signing. And full ASL mostly, it's really rare, really rare. Hang on just 1 second. We're going to switch interpreters.
All right. So I appreciate your point of view on all of that and about the deaf community. There doesn't really seem to be one specific way to be deaf. There's such a variety and different variations of language that are used by each person within the deaf community. Some speak, some sign, some you see, some use, just variety of things, cued speech. There's so many different ways to express language. It's just something, to remember in the back of your head as families. Everybody that you meet within the deaf community, they're individuals. It's not just something that's specific to the whole community. And it's important for our church as well. Our church can't really, send people away. So we want to include everybody. We have a voice interpreter every week so that anybody that wants to randomly join, they will be able to understand what's happening. The point of it is, of course, for the deaf community, but now, we're becoming more inclusive. It's a lot of different types of people and signing styles, preferences, accents. Some just finger spell and use English a lot. Some have a mix, and I'm fine with any of it. It's a big variety. So speaking of the different ways that, deaf people sign and everything and related to that, what did your parents think of the deaf community? Or, what should parents think for their children? Hold on, let me go back. So many parents might feel that they need to be involved just for their child, not for themselves. And so I want to ask you, hearing parents, can they be involved in the deaf community as well? They should be involved. Unfortunately, sometimes they seem to be afraid. The signing seems to go over their head or whatever it may be. And so sometimes they're like, oh, what do? I don't really know how to go from here. Sometimes there's not a lot of support for parents. You know, it's 2022, there should be more support. But really, at our church, we make a point to include everybody, the parents, all of them. We wanted to be able to teach them sign, to communicate. You know, we want the parents to be willing to be involved as well. We want them to be involved with the deaf community. Even if they've been an interpreter for a long time, or if they're new, maybe they've married into this and this is, you know, become their new beliefs. Again, it's very broad. You know, the deaf community isn't only fully deaf. There's a lot of people, even like me. Some of us have phones and we can talk on them a little bit. Some of us can't. Some of us can speak, some of us can sign, you know, and parents can also be included in that. They have to be. The signing community doesn't only mean deaf. It's a signing community. You know, if you think about that perspective of it being a signing community, you know, we're all inclusive. And it becomes a bigger community as well. Everyone can benefit, not just the children, parents, and even hearing people. Anybody that really wants to get involved and learn the culture. Yes, I think that's a beautiful point. I know that many parents sometimes want to get involved and, you know, they want to be involved in the signing community and they'll socialize. And they think it's for their child, but then they start meeting all these other parents and, oh, that's cool. They're more adult friends and they start interacting with people like them as well. And it just becomes this immersive inclusion for everybody. And everybody just becomes rooted together. It's beautiful. Your parents, were they hearing or deaf? Oh, I'm the only deaf one in my family. My parents are hearing. I have a brother. My wife is hearing. I mean, his wife is hearing. My children are hearing. There's going to be a baby born soon, and all of them so far are hearing. Wow, I can't imagine a whole family just signing together and the great support, you know, that is there with that. It's so rich in love and immersion. It's beautiful. Really, the key, you know, to being successful in the immersion or the going back and forth between deaf and hard of hearing. There's always like 3 groups, you know, there's different experiences. Me and I wanted a supported family. That was what I wanted from the get-go. A supportive family. Like, so for example, our group, they have some teenagers, the families, and they sign at church. At school, they might have an interpreter. You know, they don't really know. What did I say? So the teenagers here, sometimes they don't, you know, they don't sign, like they'll graduate.
Many of the families don't sign.
They'll graduate high school at 18 and they really don't feel like they have any support. They don't know how to transition. They don't know how, you know, to do a lot of different things. You know, I was able to access a new world and kind of go through it step by step. And I see now, you know, my children or children like that, it's so different. And that's really touching. Sometimes it, you know, it breaks my heart because I know what it's like And I'm sure, the parents are good parents. It's a good family, but the support system is just not there. And sometimes people think, oh, deaf people are less than others, and that's not accurate either. I know some kids who are about 24, so they're young adults, and their parents have just never thought they were smart, never learned how to sign. It's always kind of awkward conversation. They drive them around. They don't really have a lot to do for themselves. And so they can't really communicate that well. But if somebody would have started this at a younger age, they would have developed great and they would have that language. And so sometimes they are seen as less than, and that's not right either. The important point is to have a supportive family, an inclusive family in anybody's life, in any child's life. And that's especially important. Without the support, or the high expectations, you need encouragement, and without that, who leads that child? Where are they going to go? So yeah, thank you, that's great. So I have one last question, two maybe, we'll see. Which one do I want? So suppose parents maybe had a bad experience with people in the deaf community, something just negative. Do you think that describes the whole community, or how does that influence the parents, the negative experience? How do they move on from that? The deaf community can be very negative sometimes, ironically. So for example, the deaf community is like an island, and they're in the middle of everything. This whole world surrounds them. But other countries, of course, are over, or like a bridge, they're just over on the other side of the bridge, meaning the communication has lapsed. And so sometimes, as they're talking to each other, or they don't really have anybody to talk to, it becomes really isolated. Sometimes there's gossiping.
I'll take it. I'll take it. I'll take it. So going back, talking about the deaf community is an island. So the deaf community is like an island. There's water all around. And the hearing people are way over there on another land. And there's no bridge to connect because there's no communication. The only bridge is an interpreter. So the deaf people talk to each other in isolation because they know each other. And of course, everybody in the deaf community knows everybody, and there's gossip. And, it's much different than the hearing community because then it's all spread out. You can transfer to another hearing world, but the deaf world, you cannot. It's not as easy to transfer to another deaf world. But there are many deaf who recognize that and realize that more. They're more mature. They're more connected. There are good deaf people in the deaf community, and don't yet. I've seen trauma happen many times, but that's not representative of the whole deaf community because, again, it's not just one group. There's a range, there's a variety, and many people who are verbal or they sign at the same time or they're oral, many people in the deaf community, it's a broad spectrum. It's not just one. So, like, you have an example with one bad egg, and everybody's not the same way. It's really important, to talk about because, yeah, you're right. Sometimes there's a bad situation that might happen. There's a bad experience, a bad encounter, and that could be the hearing parents' only interaction with the deaf community. Whoa. But you're right. It's really important to keep in the back of your mind that that is just one experience, just one situation. And that's not representative of the whole community, because there are many people who are really invested in knowing the parents and the family and speaking with them. Okay. I think now is a good time to transition to Q&A. Just to remind those of you who have already experienced this before, and maybe if you're new here to this event, we would like to ask for families first to ask their questions. Once the families have completed asking their questions, then we will open the floor for professionals and other community members to ask their questions. You can open your screen. You can type it in the chat box, or, if you prefer to voice it, go for it. It's up to you. If you want to open your screen, give me just a second so I can spotlight you. The floor is open. Come on, parents, ask your questions. Y'all shy? Are you thinking? Oh, yes. Hold on just a moment.
Hi.
All right, go ahead.
I have a question. Okay, so I have a 1-year-old son. Is it better for him to go to regular school, or is it better for him to go to a deaf and blind school?
Well, that's a really good question. Each parent will have to, sit down and analyze which is going to be the best fit for your child. Like, for example, we have one child here who lives here close to the district, who's 3 years old, who they're wanting to put the child into the regular school, and the school board's refusing it. And they said, later, the child might become hearing. And so they're refusing an interpreter. And so they're having a struggle with that board still. And so they decided what was best for their child was to move their child to Columbus for the school for the deaf, because the child would have more support and sign language. But not every parent has that option.
Okay.
Some districts, like here near my office, near the church, they do have interpreters for mainstreamed, and the students really do well in the mainstream program. Really, it just really depends on your location, and are they going to offer an interpreter? Do they have a good mainstream program? Can the child both sign and is it oral? Or if they go to the deaf school, how far are they going to send them? Is it going to be 3 hours? What does your family think is going to be best for your child? And then make your decision based on that. Like I said, it varies.
Okay, thank you so much.
Also, I would recommend you to visit the schools and speak with the people at the schools, ask them your questions for both the deaf school and for the mainstream school, the public school. Ask them all your questions. You're going to get a lot of answers through doing that. And you will see who is more qualified to work with your child.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you. Okay. So we have another question here in the chat box. One person by the name of Andrea said, I'm curious what worship looks like at your church. Oh, that's a good question. Most of the time, my wife leads the worship. And what we do, mostly, we have YouTube songs in the background that people can see the caption on. And someone stands in front of it and signs it. And then everyone copy signs. We like to include the drums because deaf people can actually feel the vibration. At other times, we have a few deaf people who are in the church who have been creative and written their own songs without music. And so they just sign the words to rhythm. and we include the drum in that, and that's it. Deaf really like that more. But we require more time to prepare, to think, to write. And sometimes it's easier, to stick YouTube back here and then use the interpreter, and that way the hearing can have it. And so we like to empower the deaf themselves to create songs themselves, to be more, to empower them to do it and not rely on the interpreters so much. Again, it's a variety, but the deaf like, to write their deaf written songs with their own rhythm. They really like that. Oh, how cool. Angie said, hello, thank you for sharing your story with us. May I ask you a question? Is how you communicated with your future wife when you first met her? You'd mentioned she was hearing, so how did y'all communicate? Oh, okay. That story. The background, I was in the master's program and I was going to school, and we're talking about who's going to pay for the interpreter, which meant vocational rehabilitation pay or someone else pay. So for 4 weeks, I had no interpreter because everybody's like, we're not paying. So who's going to pay? So the first class, I was sitting there and I looked up and I was trying my best to speech read. And I noticed that there was a student who kept walking around trying to find a seat. And it was this girl. Hey, she's kind of pretty. I was like, yeah, I noticed her. And the next class, she sat beside me and she was talking. Of course, I couldn't understand what she was saying. That was going to be my wife. So anyway, I did that deaf nod thing, acting like I understood her because, hey, she was pretty. I was going to pretend like I could get in on the conversation. It's like, yeah, yeah. So 2 or 3 weeks later, an interpreter showed up and sat down in front of me and started signing to me. And she looked at me and she goes, are you deaf? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, oh, I didn't know that. And so long story short, she decided to learn sign language herself. And she asked me to teach her, but really, honestly, I was still learning ASL myself at the time. So there was no way I could teach her. She would have to learn on her own. So I was like, yeah, sure, fine. So she watched the interpreter more than I did. So, she learned to sign fluently, and we got married a year later. Exactly. So it was pretty smooth. It was fate. It was fate. All right. Janet had a question, said, what was it like going through the process of school with an interpreter? Oh, it was a good experience for me because through school, the interpreter I had, well, one was really good, very expressive. The other one, was more C. And I do remember when I was little in elementary school, there was this one, I felt like the interpreter, was kind of like my mama, and I realized, no, uh, in elementary school at an early age, I needed to say, I would prefer signing, or, I want you to sit up there and be professional instead of her being all up in my business, because I didn't like that. I wanted to be independent. And I learned that myself at an early age. So later on in middle school and high school, the professional interpreter I had sat in front of me. I really enjoyed it. It was a smooth experience for me. And for me, school, I was more connected to the interpreter, because they signed and the other kids did not sign. So I really didn't have much relationship with the other kids in the local school. It was more with the interpreter. Thank you for expounding on that. I wanted to ask you, you said that you had a lot of relation with the interpreter, but not the other kids. But did you have opportunities to socialize with the other kids who were like you, who were deaf and hard of hearing? Did you socialize with deaf kids? Yes and no. I knew them through my interpreter because she invited me to deaf events and learning to sign. And at that time, it was 90s, mid 90s, mid to late 90s. The deaf were more, they were against anyone who did oral, and because they were really resistant to me. And so I wasn't able to be involved in the deaf events. But then once I learned sign and I met other deaf, they were very friendly to me and very accepting. And so I learned sign from them. But growing up, I really didn't socialize a lot with the deaf. Mostly it was hearing. Okay. Andrea said, thank you. My son plays drums and my daughter is deaf. I've always wondered about that. I'm sorry, could you say that again? Andrea, she was just responding to your comment about the drums in church. And she said her son plays the drums and her daughter is deaf. Okay. So we're going to open the floor for the professionals to ask their questions. If anything, come ahead. Y'all thinking? Sharon Bryant says she has a question. Come ahead, Sharon. Hang on just a second, Sharon. We need to spotlight you. Okay. Thank you for your story. I'm wondering about deaf people who go to deaf church. I know there are different congregations where there are comfort levels. So typically, do the deaf like deaf church because maybe there are others who like to go with an interpreter or services where they can elaborate? So why do deaf people join different deaf churches? That's a very good question. When I started here, there was only signing, and they invited me to come to the church. And so now we have an interpreter who's hearing, and the church is here, and our church is deaf. It is not under the hearing church. They're two separate entities. So we have our own board, and the deaf church is the only one who pays me. Like I said, they're separate. The deaf church is not under the hearing church. And we provide options. We provide interpreters at the 10:30 for hearing or deaf church at 12 o'clock. And the reason why is because we know, again, there's a variety of people, deaf, hard of hearing, people who grew up with ASL, some maybe didn't, some are more comfortable with spoken English, some are more comfortable with the deaf, and maybe they like both. We have some who do both. We have some who prefer only the interpreted service because they don't want to be involved in the deaf community because it was toxic before. And so that's a safe place for them. We have people who are involved in the deaf church who want ASL, who want the Bible in a straight sign and not going through an interpreter, because the interpreter can lose some of the meaning in the translation or trying to catch up with the hearing, with the speech. And so it's whatever's best. But I've noticed that with the hearing pastors, they will start with point A and go C and D and then come back to B. So they're all over the place. But deaf people, what we tend to do, we do point A, B, C, D, and E, and then we're clear on those, and then we divide that out, and that's better for the deaf typically. That's what I found. But again, it depends on how people grew up. Are they more mainstream? They prefer more English than they would prefer with the interpreter. Some will try the deaf church and be involved, and they may stay and they may not. They may go back to the other church, but we provide the option for them. Great. I have visited Brentwood Church before. It was wonderful. The deaf church was there. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sharon. We have several questions in the chat. Tracy said, how can families find a faith community that is in the deaf community? How can families find that? Okay. It's not easy. Word of mouth. Google search. You can search deaf churches and you can pull them up in by city. And now, they have a website called www.deafchurchwhere.com. And there will be a list with red dots and it'll show you all the different churches, the different denominations. It will show up, are there interpreters there? Is it completely deaf? Is it half and half? You can pull that up on that website. Also, it's hosted by Deaf Bible, I believe. And they post for Deaf Church where, and you can find them there because they're hard to find, some places that have interpreters. If the city's rural, they might not have a big city, you can call the church and say, hey, do you have an interpreter? Would you be willing to provide an interpreter or something like that? Great. Thank you. Amanda has a question. Says that's very interesting how the deaf community is exclusive back in the 90s. I'm really glad that it's more inclusive for different hearing types and communication practices. Now, is that still the same? Are they still exclusive? Some. Some are exclusive, some are inclusive. Maybe it'd be easier for me because now I'm involved, in just signing ASL. Maybe it would be easier. So, I think it'd be more inclusive now because I'm around more and more people. But I think that the church is more inclusive now than in the past. In college, yeah, there were still a lot of battles about ASL using English fingerspelling or not, or, should you use that? Should you not? There were a lot of battles about that going on several years. And I think that in the community, generally, it's more inclusive. I would agree with that as well, Joe. In the past, there was a lot more divide, a lot more because of social media and, people taking the blinders off. I really think that, there's a lot more camaraderie. Okay. Rachel has a question. She says, I'm an interpreter at church. Do you live stream your church service? I would love ideas about how we grow our ministry. Our website has many saved videos on it. Also, right now, because of money, it's kind of tight. So we're doing free live stream to Facebook. And that is under my profile. And it's the sign of Christ Deaf Church. And you can see it there. Every week, our live stream starts about 12:30. Signs of Grace Church, signsofgrace.org. It's Signs of Grace Deaf Church on Facebook. Great, thank you so much. I will put that in the live chat, in the chat. Okay. I have one question from Hunter. It says, what would you like to see change in Tennessee in the education system to be more inclusive of children who have deaf in their families? Keep in mind, I'm not in Tennessee. I've not been there for a while. So I'm not really sure about, if they've had any improvements yet or not. One thing that I can say is that in the past, growing up there and in college, I visited a few deaf classes there and volunteered. One thing I would like to see more of and expect to raise the bar, especially for mainstream. And deaf teachers, they need to raise their expectations they typically lower their expectations, and often, I'm not sure Tennessee requires certification for interpreters. Am I right? I think I don't know. Can anyone confirm that or no? Maybe it's changed, maybe it'll change soon, but that means that they're less qualified interpreters, and teachers for the deaf will be in the system, and they'll be hearing, and they'll be trying to evaluate. How are they going to evaluate if that's good quality in the system? How are they going to evaluate if they're signing well or not? Or, if they're signing really well. In Ohio, it's the same. There's no certification, but there's more community awareness. It needs to be more, I don't know. It needs to be different. I would say, like in Texas, they require certification. So the system, their system is top because it requires that. Each state's different, depending on the state legislature to pass laws to protect the deaf, especially in education as well. All states have it. I wanted to clarify that. Maybe some people do not understand certified and non-certified interpreters. So an interpreter can be certified to confirm that they are qualified, a qualified interpreter, that they are fluent and advanced in ASL and their skills and their signing and their receptive skills. Some interpreters are not certified, which means, no one can confirm if they can sign fluently, good or not. So in education system, many mainstream programs do not have a certified interpreter. So that means that a child is are they getting regular information ASL? That's the question. You got a 50-50 shot. So that's the point, is that there's no law related to that. Yeah. Yeah, people are responding to that, making comments about that. I wanted to clarify one comment Rima made and said a deaf teacher can be qualified no matter if they're certified or not. I think Joe was talking about interpreters and not teachers, right? Hearing deaf teachers, not deaf teachers, not deaf teachers. No, I've seen in Ohio here, there are several hearing signing. Sometimes it's not the best for the kids. And the deaf mostly, they sign just fine. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. I want to make sure we were all on the same page on that. Okay, we're nearing the end of our event. If anyone has any questions for Joe before we wrap it up, now's your chance. Come on. A lot of people are really interested about that discussion, whether or not certified. Maybe that should be another topic for the future. Oh, one comment, the last one about court interpreters. Yeah, court interpreters is not always qualified interpreter. I'll give you one example. 2020 court. Another deaf person I was there. And anyway, the interpreter showed up, had black hands, black shirt, black gloves. Yes. Okay. Black gloves, black shirt, black mask, signing. And they couldn't see their hands. The signing skill was which means the deaf community tends to play the lottery when they go to court, or someone whose hearing is hiring the interpreter. And here we have a few agency interpreters that do not evaluate their interpreters. They just shove them in, and they may not be qualified. I've seen that in the hospital as well. Some hearing people will pick the oldest, or the cheapest and charge for them. So, yep, I've seen it happen. And that's where a lot of things we can really work on as a community to push for better policies, for better laws to be passed to protect our most vulnerable people. The deaf people who are stuck in the court system, or who are in prison system, or stuck in the hospital. We need to make sure that we're looking at those people. Oh, yeah. One comment said CDI, Certified Deaf Interpreter. That is a deaf, that is a deaf sign language interpreter, and a hearing interpreter is translating it into English. And so that's a good point. You could use that. And also the interpreter who's hearing may not always voice for the deaf person well. And so it depends on the qualifications. And so really who can voice for that person well. CDI, some deaf can sign and speak for deaf easier. They can read it and understand it easier. So that's a good point. Yes. Beautiful. So Joe, we are right here in the last few minutes of our event. Do you have any final comments as we wrap up with our parents and families? I'm just telling parents, don't be afraid. I know you're going to have fear, but don't. Find a community, find that's positive for you. If you've had a trauma experience with someone in the past in the community, don't give up. You will find some good positive resources and support. If you live in a rural area way on out and the school board is not willing to help you provide an interpreter, contact TSD. They've got a lot of help they can offer. Also, you will see discrimination against your child. What you need to do is you need to be ready to fight. You have a choice. They say, no, we're not providing interpreters. Or you say, I want this, 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 and this. You have that right to say, yes, I demand it in the IEP. Have it documented, and they have to follow it. And that's a big thing. The IEP, you as a parent, you have a right to demand what you want in the IEP for your child. And then they have to follow it by law. It doesn't matter what the state is. And that's a big thing. You as the parent have the power. Beautiful. Oh, I got chills. Perfect. Thank you so very much. Everyone, you can open your screens and you can say your goodbyes and all of that all the way around. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, interpreters. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, thank you. We really appreciate you. All righty. Bye. Thank you, thank you.